Hey everyone, welcome to another CS0 Intro to Java Programming video. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to use JSliders and how to get values off of those JSliders in order to inform something that gets drawn to the screen. Now in this unit, you're going to do a project that's going to modify the smiley face project that you did in the last unit. The modified project is going to look something like this. It's going to randomly draw smileys to the screen based on a timer. That timer, every time it ticks or updates, it will invoke action performed, and it will call in the draw smiley method and draw a smiley to the screen. We'll have the ability to speed up that timer, slow down that timer using a slider. We also will have the ability to make the smiley faces ranges bigger and smaller. So now my max size is going to be 200. You'll see some larger smiley faces will start to be drawn. And then my min size could be smaller, or my max size could be smaller. You can see the max size is now much smaller. Okay, so the biggest they can be is 50 pixels. So it'll draw our random smileys using information off of those sliders. All right? That's what project we're working towards. In order to do that, we're going to need to be able to use sliders, we're going to need to be able to use timers, we're going to be able to need to use objects, instance variables, have instance variables pull things from GUI components, use those values that are stored in those instance variables to update something in the paint. It's a lot of complexity there. So let's take a look at a simple project using sliders. This one's called Slider Practice, and what it's going to do is it's going to draw a rectangle to the screen, and we're going to set the height and width using the slider. So I'll draw, and you'll see it makes my rectangle there, and that's the height and width. I can set my height shorter, draw, and then it draws a shorter rectangle. Make my width bigger, it draws a wider one. Go to the max, go to the min, go up to the max, and that's what this program does. Pretty simple. We're going to use those sliders, we're going to get data off of those sliders, and then we're going to use that data to draw our rectangle. All right, so the usual stuff here. Class slider practice extends JFrame, implements action listener, and something new called change listener. The sliders have a listener called change listener, and it looks for change in that slider. It looks for where it was previously to where it has gone. All right. We have a draw panel like usual. I've got a button called draw like usual. I've got two labels, height label and width label, which were going to be the labels next to those sliders. See, there's my height and my width label. Then I've got a width slider and a height slider. And those two sliders are going to be used to control how big and small that rectangle is going to be. I've got instance variables for height and width, and these are of type int. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to retrieve the height off the height slider and store it in here, retrieve the width off the width slider and store it in here, and then I'm going to use the height and width to draw my rectangles. Pretty cool. Okay, my main. It does all the stuff that main normally does, instantiates my frame, sets a size, creates a GUI. That's the GUI method that we always do. And I'm setting the height to 0 and setting the width to 0. I'm just initializing them to 0. And then I've got a method called Initialized Variables. Let's take a look at that. Initialized Variables is going to get the data off of the JPanel, and it's going to set an initial size. Okay, this is just going to set up the initial state for my rectangle. So draw panel, get preferred size, get width divided by 2. So what I want the width of my rectangle to be by default is going to be half the width of the panel. Okay, get preferred size is going to retrieve a dimension from the panel, and getWidth will retrieve the width int from that dimension. I'm going to do the same thing with the height. So draw panel, get preferred size, get height will retrieve the height essentially from the draw panel divided by 2. So this is going to set up the height and width of my rectangle to start with so that it's half the size. So if I just run this and hit draw without updating those sliders, the rectangle would be half and half. But these are set to a default variable, and I'll show you, or a default value, and I'll show you how those are going to be used in a little bit. But I just wanted to give us an initial state there for the height and width. Let's look at our GUI. All this stuff is going to be pretty standard, what we always do. Default close operation, creator container, set the layout, instantiate my draw panel, instantiate my button. I'm creating a dimension called panel size, which is going to get the preferred size from that. So I could just, when I want to get the width and height from it, it doesn't have to be a long call. It's just going to be panel size, get width, panel size, get height. Now what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to use those for the initial arguments in my sliders. So here's instantiate my 2 sliders, height slider and width slider. They're going to get new JSliders. So this is the JSlider constructor. And what I've got here are 2 arguments to start with. The min value on the slider and the max value on the slider. Okay, so the biggest that I want the slider to be, in other words, the highest value we can get off of it, is going to be the width of our panel minus 15. Okay, so if my panel is 400 wide, the highest value we're going to be able to have on that slider is going to be that width minus 15, or 400 minus 15. Okay, 385. And then the JSlider width slider is going to be, I've got these kind of swapped here, but the panel size get height minus 15. What I mean by that is I have these swapped. It says my height slider is using my width, and my width slider is using my height. Not paying close attention to detail. So I'm just going to update these. It doesn't matter for this because my JPanel is square, but if it was not square, this would be a real issue. So height slider is now going to get height divided by 2, and width slider is going to now get width minus 15. Okay? So my sliders are going to set to a minimum value and a maximum value. What I mean by that is if I slide all the way down to the left side, 50 is the smallest number that'll be able to come off that slider. And if I slide all the way to the right side, the width of the panel minus 15 is going to be the highest value that I'll get off that slider. Okay, so if the width is 400, 385 would be what would be the maximum number I could get off that slider. The reason I want to do this is I want to throttle the size of those rectangles to, to make sure that they fit fully within my frame. All right, so that's instantiating my 2 sliders. These are my slider objects, and I can call methods from the JSlider class to them. In fact, I'm going to call a method to get the value off of that slider in a little bit. Right, I'm creating my labels, I'm adding all my components to my content pane, and then I register my listeners. Now, action listener is going to be used to register the button, and add change listener is going to be used to register my 2 sliders. Given that my class is a change listener and an action listener, I'm going to pass this into each of these method calls, thereby registering each of these components so that they now are interactive, so that when I update that slider and every time it moves 1 tick, it's going to call on that method that's associated with it. State change. All right, so I'm going to run this again. I've already got it up here. When I slide this, what happens is every tick that I slide it, it's going to call on the state change method. And you'll see what happens in state change in just a minute. And when I click on draw, it's going to call on action performed, and it's going to then draw that rectangle based on whatever's on these sliders. Okay? Right, let's look at state changed first. Right, so state change, like I said, gets invoked every time I move one of those sliders. Every time it moves a single tick, or a pixel if you will. And I'm going to retrieve the data from that slider. It's going to retrieve the essentially the integer that's associated with that place on the slider line. So if it's dead center, it's going to be, it's going to pull the number off that slider at that dead center number, which is, if it's between 50 and 385, it's going to, pull that middle value between those two. So half the difference of those two values. So getValue is a method from the JSlider class, and what it does is it retrieves the value off of the slider as an int. Then I can store it in this height variable. And then I'm going to get the width from the width slider, so get the value from the width slider and store it into width. So we're retrieving our height and width. Every time you update one of those sliders, it'll retrieve both height and width. Okay, if width didn't change, that's okay, because it's going to retrieve that same number that was there before. If width did change, it'll retrieve the updated value. Now what's going to happen when I click that button is it's going to look at height and width, and it's going to use those to draw some kind of rectangle. So like we saw in a previous video, I kind of have to do this hack right here to make it look like it's drawing it fresh, making a rectangle filled with white for the full size of that draw panel. Then I set the color black so that when I draw my new rectangle, it's just black. And g.drawRect. And what I'm going to do here is get the panel width and panel height, divide it by 2, and then I'm going to subtract the width divided by 2 from it. And that's going to give us a rectangle that will be dead center on the panel, set at the height and width that was retrieved from those sliders. So width and height here, you remember they're retrieved from state changed. So every time I move that slider, height and width update. Well, they get used here to inform how we're going to draw the rectangle to that panel. Okay? So once again, we're using these objects and instantiating them. We're having them interact with instance variables. And then we're using those instance variables to inform our drawings. So we've got this chain of things that are happening. We've got the GUI, which is meant to retrieve user input. We've got the variables that's meant to store data from that user input. And then we've got the drawing, which is going to use those variables to draw. Okay? Got one more video off after this that's going to use timers, and it's going to be kind of a psychedelic little program. So tune in, enjoy. Thanks for